This is my new van. I just pulled it at a scrapyard, and this series is where I'm going to show you how I return this back to be a usable vehicle for a daily driver. Obviously, it didn't look like this when I pulled out the jaws of the crusher. It had a horrendous vinyl wrap on it, all the plastics were yellow, deteriorated, it had accident damage down the side of it. If you want to see how I fixed it, stick around, watch this series, and I'm going to show you every step. This episode is made up mostly of random clips taken over the course of a month and a bit, so you will have to excuse the lack of introductions and such. That's going to be done by me in post, in voiceover. What you'll be seeing on your screen now is a selection of pictures of the sill, which is the first major bit of bodywork we had to do on this vehicle. The damage to the sill is some of the most extensive I have ever seen. I've never seen anything like this before. The only way I can think that damage like this could have occurred was that at some point it must have been picked up by a forklift. Public service announcement, don't pick your car up with a forklift, because this kind of stuff will happen. Anyway, as you'll be seeing now, what we did to fix it was fairly simple. We just sprayed some primer up inside to get it in between the three layers of the sill, and then folded it back together again with a set of vice grips. That chipped off most of the underseal, but we fixed that later. After we'd got it sort of squeezed together and formed round like that, we just sort of sprayed again over with some more of the primer. Again, I don't know if you'll be able to see that or not, I can't remember if I filmed it. But we sprayed more primer over it and then put some underseal on that, which then we let set and painted some white paint over because we only had black underseal. But yes, this is the first job out the way. That was fairly easy. Just figured I'd grab my camera quickly and show you this, because it was a small job and it escalated. So we're taking the wrap off this section, which is the passenger side sill, in between the cabin door and the sliding door to the back of the van. In between those two, I've been taking the wrap off, and there was some surface rust over this bit here. I'll put a picture up on the screen because I took a picture before I did it. So I put some rust converter onto that, which is basically a chemical which converts the rust from iron oxide into iron trioxide, I think. But basically it stops it rusting further. So I did that, worked fine. I got some sandpaper, went to sand it down so I could skim some filler and paint it, and this fell out. It just completely disintegrated. So there is now a big hole in the sill, and this is structural sill as well, because just round here is the mounting for the seat belt. Mounts in down here onto this, so this is a structural part of the vehicle. The cause of the problem is, in my opinion, a bit of a stupid design from the Ford engineers. What they've done is, on the sliding door, there is this kind of hook, which is what guides it in its bottom rail, and there's another mechanism up the top rail. This big long hook here sticks out quite a way in front of the door, so this has to go in somewhere, which is why they have a big cavity behind here, hopefully you can see that, behind this panel. And somehow, from inside this panel, there is a hole. I'm not sure exactly where. I think you can just about feel it with your finger. I'm not sure if it's visible, but there's a hole just on the other side of here, like here, which goes in behind, down into this space here, behind this inside the sill. What that basically means is, especially because how this vehicle has been used, laterally speaking, it would seem this vehicle was a ground maintenance or like a park maintenance vehicle. So they were transporting plants and soil and stuff. When I got it, the whole back was completely full with compost. I had to shovel it out. But that also meant that this space here on this step to get into the back was covered with compost. And of course, when you open the door, all that compost would fall down here. And because people weren't cleaning it off, as soon as you close the door, this mechanism here on the sliding door would push all of that wet compost into this gap here, which was a pain to clean out. Had to do it with basically a long, thin washing machine drainage hose and try and get it into here to get it out. I think might have used some Copex as well, I can't remember. But basically had to try and get all this hoovered out. But what's been happening over the time of that is the wet compost has then been falling down through this gap into here. So all this was also full in here of wet compost, which was again a complete pain to get out, had to hoover that out. And that's then been sitting here, and it has rusted out the internal wall of the sill, the internal structural reinforcing, to reinforce for this big hole, because that's what the seatbelt mount around here has to mount onto something structural. There's nothing structural here, so it goes through and mounts onto the structural sill, which goes into the chassis. But it's rusted out the structural part of that sill, and then has rusted through to the outer skin of the sill. In terms of how to fix this, it's, in order to do it properly so it'll pass its MOT, it's going to need basically a lump of the sill, the rusted section, cut out, and a new structural panel welded in, which I'd been hoping to avoid welding, although for like an 18-year-old vehicle, 17, 18-year-old vehicle, I'm not overly concerned. Like, you would be expecting to have to do structural welding on a vehicle of this age. So the fact the only problem it's got structural rust-wise is a tiny hole in a sill, I'm pretty happy with. But yeah, unfortunate but manageable.
Right, what we'll do is we'll try and cut across the top here and across the bottom here, and what I want to do is leave these curves, so ideally we'll try and keep the panel that we're going to weld in here as flat as possible, and once we've got a hole here we'll obviously get the worst of this rusty bit out. This is obviously quite soft here, so this is obviously, most of this has broken away on the back, but we'll try and keep above that bottom edge of the sill there, because it will be easier to weld in a sort of flat panel rather than having to try and form one around the corner. But we'll just have to make it up as we go along. It really just depends how far this goes, but we'll see how we get on. So when we do the grinding, there's a couple of things that I'm a wee bit concerned about. So it's where the sparks are going. So the sparks are really quite hot, obviously, and they can effectively melt into the paintwork if we're not careful. And then you know, you wash the car and you end up with rusty spots in the paint, but also they can go into the glass, so like the windscreen and so on, and they can actually melt into the glass. So we'll put these mats down on the floor, and then I've got this heat resistant mat that we put here, so if the grinder is sending the sparks this way, hopefully this blanket will catch 90% of it. But what I'll do is I'll cut quite carefully, so we're not pressing too hard, and hopefully we'll not have, you know, piles and piles of sparks. So there will be some sparks, but we'll try and basically do it quite gently, so keeps the amount of sparking under control. So I'll cut across the top first, I think, and just sort of see how that goes, and then we'll do a cut along the bottom. What I am going to do is take my watch off, because in the same way as the glass, you can end up getting the metal filings in the face of your watch. Get these bits out then and see what this looks like behind. So ideally I wouldn't have gone up this high. The grinder's kind of slipped a bit, but we can always, you know, when we're welding it, we can just tack this back in. So it's not too bad looking at that. So this is, you can see on the cut edge here, we've got a reasonable thickness of steel, which is really what I'm after. So when we weld a patch in here, we've got something to actually weld it onto. So I'll just get something that I can give that a prod with and just check that it's not just going to break straight through. So you can see how this is flexing, which means that there's really not an awful lot of material there. So, you know, it shouldn't do that. This side, it still flexes a bit. But you can hear it kind of being all crispy, whereas this side, although it's flexing, it's not sounding all horrible. So I think what we'll do is we'll just take a little bit more out of this, I think. So what I'll maybe do is we'll come along to about here, so which will hopefully see this kind of, you can kind of almost see the wetness mark there of where the rust is coming through the back. There you go. So yes, clearly it's not very very sound, that bit. So I think that's what we'll do as well. We'll cut down here and we'll just gradually go further and further, and hopefully we have some van left at the end of it. So this little bit here, so again, is pretty nasty. So again, I'm wondering, ideally I don't want to go around this curve at the bottom, but I'm wondering if we should maybe try and come down a little bit lower down here so we can get rid of this bit. Is really quite, again, thin. See, very thin in fact. So it's a slightly odd construction, this, because it's like it's got two skins. It's got this really thin skin on the top, which seems to be galvanized, and then there's this thicker steel at the back. But I think what we'll do is we'll cut along here, just hopefully just above this curve, and then I think we'll take out, because I think that's equally as thin. So I think we'll come up here, and then hopefully that will lose the majority of this bit that's rusty, and yet it's still a kind of reasonable sized patch that we can weld in there. So I think we'll just take this piece out as well, because I think this is equally quite thin, and then I think that will probably be a good place to stop. This is a little bit thin on the bottom here still, just this very little bit, but I don't really want to go down lower than that generally, because then I'm going to have to start forming this curve, and I think it will be a little bit harder to make it you know, a kind of invisible repair. And also I think we'll start affecting the majority of this is still quite solid, and I think we'll potentially start affecting the structural strength if we go round here too far. So I think we'll try not to do that. So if necessary, we can hopefully just bridge this in a bit with a bit of weld. So kind of see here, it's certainly on this side it's very thin just where this damage is here, but it gets thicker towards each side. So by the time we're cutting along the bottom and the top now, these bits are is nice thick steel, and I think I'm happier now that we're getting into a bit that's more solid along this way. So although there's certainly surface rust on the inside of the sill here, I think what we'll do is we'll get a hoover, we'll hoover out all of the rust debris, because the kind of flakes of rust will tend to encourage more rust to form on the inside of this panel. And then we'll get the inside of this treated with sort of zinc primer, and handily just underneath the sill here there's a rubber bung which the factory would have used to put their rust treatment in, so we can basically remove that rubber bung, and then once we've done our weld repair we can get some wax oil up inside this sill cavity all around this area, and then that will hopefully, the wax oil's got a sort of rust treatment in it, so that will help stop the rust getting any worse, and then hopefully it will be good to go for a good few years more. So we'll stick some masking tape over the top of this, and then we can rub around the edge of that and it will give us a witness mark, and then we can peel that off and use it as a template. So I'll probably double it up just so that when I take it off it doesn't tear. But if I just basically stick some masking tape over this. So what we'll try and do, we'll try and get this panel as close as we can to the size, so we'll cut it a little bit big and then gradually grind it down, so hopefully it's quite a tight fit, which will make it easier when we weld it. It will be less likely to kind of blow through. So if we've got like a half, a 2mm gap or something that you're trying to weld, then the steel's quite thin, so it tends to just blow through in a big hole, and then you end up just getting a huge mess basically. Try another bit. So I'll stick that on, and then, like I say, I think I'll just so it doesn't kind of distort too much when I peel that off, I'm just going to double that up just so it's a bit thicker. Yep, so I'll just rub around with my fingers like this now, and then hopefully what I did do before we stuck the tape on here is I just took the raggy burrs off the metal, just with a knife really, so it's not got razor sharp edges, because otherwise you'd end up shredding your fingers, which wouldn't be good. So that should be fine, and then we can hopefully peel that off and we'll be able to see that outline quite clearly. And then hopefully when we stick that on the steel, we'll be able to see the witness mark on that. So I've got my masking tape off the van, so I've got my witness mark round here. So what I'll do is I'll cut round that with a pair of scissors. So the panel I've got here it's an old control panel, basically an electrical control cabinet. It was a cover off it. It just happens to be the perfect thickness to match the steel in the van. It's just under 1mm. It's much easier when you're welding to weld similar thicknesses of steel together. So I'll cut round this, and then we can get that stock on, and then hopefully just cut it out following my line. So I'll make it slightly bigger, so I'm just going to try and cut round just outside my line, so that hopefully the panel, when I cut it out, will be slightly too big, and then we can always just shave a wee bit off it. It works quite well doing this though with the masking tape. So it doesn't have to be absolutely exact, to be honest. Though the weld will fill a crack within reason. So a couple of millimeters you can fill with a weld. It just makes it a little bit harder because it tends to blow through. So now I've got my little template here. I'll just use this cut edge as my first one, hopefully. So it's obviously slightly, obviously when I've cut it, it's slightly banana shaped, but I'll stick that on and then I'll just grind this out to match. So we can hopefully just cut round this and we'll end up with a good fitting panel. We'll grind this down now. I've roughly cut that, but we'll grind it with the flat wheel and just hopefully get it to as close as we can to the profile of the tape, and then it should hopefully go straight in. So that's a very tight fit now, it will just go in. I'll just take a teeny bit more off. So I think that'll work, I think. So it might need a teeny bit more cutting, but we're a little bit it's too big along the bottom here. But I think what we'll do is we'll now try and see if we can get a little bit of a curve into this, and then it will hopefully fit in better, and then we can measure the bit along the bottom and again grind a bit more off the base. So to get a bend in this, what I'm going to try and do is clamp this in the vise and then basically do 3 very slight folds, 1 in the middle and 2 on each side, and the whole thing, it only needs to be about 5mm, you know, off the flat plane, so it's quite slight, but we'll give it a go and see if it works. The good thing is if we overdo it, we can always just kind of bend it flat again with a pair of pliers, or just give it a tap with a mallet. So I'll clamp that in, and I'll use a bit of wood, and then hopefully just give this a knock and just start it bending. Just have a look and see. So I'm really going for quite slight. We can always do a bit more. It's probably actually done it a little bit too much. So, and then I'm going to go to the middle. Now obviously when I clamp it in the vise, it's going to tend to flatten out the curve that I've just done. I'm not too worried because I want to try and end up with a fairly smooth curve and not a very tight bend. And now let's just take that out and just do one more here. So this is obviously giving me a little bit of some straight lines in this, but we will skim over the top of all of this once we've got it fitted with a bit of filler, so I'm not too worried if it's not absolutely perfect. I'm not going for absolute perfection, so you can maybe see in the light there we've got kind of like 3 straight lines in that, but hopefully now we've got a lovely curve on this. So what we'll do is we'll try that on the sill of the van and just see if that's roughly right. So I'm just going to try this on the sill and just see how it follows. So I'm just using the bit next to where we're working, so it's pretty good, but I can see here it's I just need a little bit more on the bottom, and this top edge is starting to roll in a little bit more on a sharper radius. So I think we'll try and clamp this in the vise quite close to the edge here and just do another wee fold on the top, but it's certainly getting there, I think.
So while we were waiting for the filler to dry over the top of the patch, we came up with what I think is quite a clever trick actually, and one that might be worth making a note of if you ever need to use it in the future. We have taken the tube and the sort of spray nozzle off the top of a can of WD-40 and fitted that on the top of a can of zinc primer, which you'll be seeing my dad there using to sort of spray the primer up inside around the sill on the back of the patch in order to cover over any bits where the weld has burnt off the weld through primer we had put on the back of the panel, or any other bits of exposed metal that are around there. So yeah, maybe a useful trick that some of you might find interesting. After letting that filler dry fully, we then sanded that with a 120 grit sandpaper just to make it smooth. Before we applied a second skim coat of filler over the top of that, we let that cure fully as well before we then sanded that with 120 grit to smooth it again, and then progressively finer grits up to make it a nicer surface for the first priming. And then painting, we used the same painting process on this and to repair the patch we'd filed back to allow the earth clamp for the welding, as we did on the front wing, which you'll be seeing next. This dent on the front wing I think is a really good place to showcase that you do not necessarily need fancy tools in order to get what I hope you'll agree are a really quite good result. As you can see here, my dad is using a extension bar from a socket set to try and work this dent back into approximately the right shape, rather than taking the panel off and then using a hammer and dolly set to beat it back in shape, which is what they would do in a professional body shop. We're not too worried about getting that crease out, we just want to get the metal approximately back into shape so that the filler we're about to put over the top does not have to be excessively thick. We're also going to just give a rough sand over the paint that is there to give it a key so that the filler will stick and bond properly, because you don't want the filler to then fall off and ruin all of your hard work in the painting process, which will be coming next.
We've put filler on this now to fill in the score. So there was a big score basically running along here. So we filled that and a couple of dents here, and we've sanded this. There's actually 3 coats of filler on this just to get the sort of profile that we're after. We're reasonably happy with it now. So we're going to put some primer on. Now what I've done is where we've sanded it, we've sort of basically keyed up the paint in a fairly sort of tight profile round where the filler is. So what I'm going to do in this case, because I want to limit the amount of painting we're doing, I've masked round the sort of perimeter of the bit that's been keyed up with a sandpaper with a masking tape, and then I'll spray the primer on, and what we'll end up with when we take the masking off, we'll have a bit of an edge between the primer obviously and the original paint of the car. So we'll flat that back with very, very fine sandpaper, and we'll carry the keying on a little bit past that round onto the good paint. So when we paint the top coat on, we can kind of blend that in with the original paint on the van. That's the plan anyway. So we'll get some primer on this, probably just a thin coat to start with, and then we've got a bit to do at the back. We'll do that, and then we'll come back to this to do a second coat on this. And then we might do a third coat, or just see how well it covers. So I'm just trying to do little short stabby strokes on this, because I don't want to get loads of paint over on my masking. I'm trying to keep the paint as far as I can on the van, so hopefully I don't end up with a really thick edge of paint that we've got to cut off. So you can see I'm putting this on really quite thin at the moment. Just do another bit, so you can see here I've put this on a bit thick and it's already starting to run, so that's why trying to put it on a bit thinly. So we'll stop there and then we'll go to the back, and then we'll come back and have another go at this at the front. So the drip that comes into this, it's not a big problem because we're going to flat this back wet and dry paper, so we'll get rid of that when we do that. Just left that 5 minutes just to sort of dry off a little bit, so you can see by looking across the panel if it's because it's primer, it's matte when it's dry, so if it looks shiny it's still wet, and then once it dries it kind of goes matte. So we'll just, again, very thin coat, and again I'll try and avoid getting it too heavily onto my masking. So, and it should hopefully gradually start to go white. Right, so we'll stop there. So again, just need to wait another 5 or 10 minutes and then back in for another coat. Primer's done. That's about 5 coats, I think. I've slightly lost count. And what I did is I've peeled the masking tape off. Once it had sort of tacked off a bit for about 5 minutes before it was properly set, and I found it's worth doing that just to help avoiding it sort of tearing too much along the edges. Now obviously looking at that at the moment it doesn't look too great. We've got a very sort of defined edge between the original paint in the van and the primer, and this is where the next stage is going to come in. We're going to use wet and dry sandpaper, wet with a bit of water, we're washing up liquid in it, and we'll basically cut this back so that we end up with a feathered edge between our primer, the original paint on the van, and it will also key up the original paint on the van very, very slightly. So when we spray our top coat over, it will hopefully look perfect, and it's got a kind of keyed surface that it will take to. So just to recap, the reason I've gone for this technique rather than just spraying the primer on and ending up with a sort of feathered edge on your sprayed primer, if we'd done that, which you could have done, we would have ended up with the primer going significantly beyond the area where we painted. So we've got our original bit of damage, we sanded that back, this edge of the primer is pretty much at the extreme of the bit that we sanded back so that it's bonded well. And if we had just sprayed the primer on, we would have ended up with primer going significantly further out than where our repair is. So when we came to do the top coat, we would have had to take the top coat even further. So in reality, it would have ended up having to paint the entire wing, and it just would have used up rather a lot of paint. Whereas doing it this way, we can hopefully retain as much of the original paint on the van as possible, and we'll hopefully just end up having to paint just sort of around the perimeter of this, and we should hopefully get a reasonable finish. So the next stage, I'm going to do the wet and drying bit. Now basically what that does is you get a kind of slurry of wet white paint. Now if I just went at it on here, it's all going to start dripping down the grey plastics, and it will make a complete mess, and it's really difficult to clean up. So what I'm going to do is we'll just do a bit more masking around the plastic bumper and stuff, just to avoid it making too much of a mess. So we'll do that, and then we'll get back to doing the wet and dry. So just put the masking on, which is to say we'll just stop the kind of slurry water getting all over the plastics. And then I've got 1200 grit wet and dry paper, which is really, really quite fine, and a little bit of water, soapy water here, basically washing up liquid in water, and just helps it kind of slide over the paintwork a bit. And really what I'm aiming to do is the original repair is kind of in the middle of this primered panel, so I'm going to try not to do too much wet and dry over the top of that, because what I don't want to happen is our original repair to start showing back through. I want to keep it white, but I'm going to concentrate on just doing around the perimeters here to basically feather the primer into the original paint of the van, and also give us a bit of a keyed surface for the top coat. So I'll just get on with it and see how we get on. So I'm pressing really, really lightly, and I'm concentrating. I've got my fingertips basically over the top of the edge of my primer, and I just keep rubbing away in slightly circular motions, and eventually what happens is the water kind of dries up and you kind of feel it drying up. You just dip it back in again, just get it wet again, and just keep going. And it's just a case of take your time and just work away at it until the kind of hard line of an edge between the primer and the paintwork starts to disappear, and we'll hopefully end up with a nice smooth transition from the paint of the van to our primer. Now this bit here is quite thick because I was struggling when we were painting it to get the filler that was at the back here to cover, so I've just got quite a bit to do. I'm just trying to I'm trying to keep my fingers over the top of the primer and not on the bodywork of the car, because what I don't want to do is cut through the paint on the original van. Basically what I'm trying to do is just remove the edge of the primer here and not take too much off the actual original paint of the van. But it's worth taking your time on this bit, because this is the bit that makes the difference between you ending up with hopefully a sort of professional looking repair or a not so professional looking repair. Now I've just got to be very careful here where you get a panel edge, where the panel changes direction. The paint in general, when they apply it in the factory, it thins out as it goes around an edge. So if you rub away on this edge too much with the wet and dry, it will very, very quickly go through the paint, and we'll end up with a primer, the grey primer showing through the factory primer. So we've got to be very careful around the edges. So I'm being a little bit more harder on this bit here. But you can see here how this is starting to, this line, I can't feel it anymore, and the colour change between the van and the primer is starting to disappear. You can see how it's getting there. So this is what we're aiming for, is where the bodywork of the van just gradually fades away into the primer. This bit's still a little bit thick here, so we've got to do a bit more here. And you can see here where this is actually starting to cut right in. So you'll probably find the bodywork of the van slightly proud still at this point, probably from the original damage. So we've got to be a bit careful. We don't really want to be doing any more here, but we could do with doing a bit more here and a little bit more down this edge. So just try and make this slightly less defined. But even that, as you run your finger across it, you can't feel that now, whereas you certainly can feel it here. You've got to be a bit careful. It's very easy to do too much of this and end up with your original kind of filler starting to show through, or even potentially going through the paint on the van and down to the primer underneath. It's not the end of the world as long as you recognise that it's happening and just stop. So if you've just got a kind of ghosting of the primer starting to show through, the top coat will cover that up, but you don't want to end up having a huge spray patch, because then you're going to need about 75 coats of top coat to cover that. And really, to be honest, if you've gone that far, you're probably better off just putting another coat of primer on, but you really do kind of wind the clock back on that. You're kind of starting again, you're priming, and then you've got to do all this again. So it's the best thing to do is just keep a really, really close eye on it, and as soon as you start seeing any points where it's starting to go through, you stop. This bit, I can still feel a slight ridge there, so as I'm running down I can feel with my thumb it steps out slightly, so we've got a bit more to do down here. And again, there's a little bit of a ridge here, so again I'll just do a bit more along this edge. So the thing is, if you can feel a ridge with your fingers when you paint the top coat on, you'll actually be able to see that in certain lights. So your fingers are very good at telling you if things are not right. So that's better. It's starting to get there. So you see this corner now, the kind of, it just graduates from the kind of slightly bluer white of the van into the sort of yellower white of the primer, but which is absolutely ideal. So if we could get that all the way round, it would be great. It's worth wiping it every now and again because the slurry covers up a multitude of sins, so you can actually end up having gone a bit too far through and you might not have noticed. So I think that's much better. You can see how this is now starting to just graduate from, it's helpful if I've got the slurry all over my fingers. So removed all the masking from the where we'd done the wet and dry, and basically dried it all off, wiped it all over with methylated spirits to get it all nice and clean, and I've remasked, so this time I've left myself a much greater border. Now I'm not intending on spraying anywhere up to where the masking is, it's really just to control the overspray, so that as a spray, I don't end up with it going absolutely everywhere. But the idea is I'll try, I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but I've got the sort of witness line going around here where we've wet and dried, so which has just taken the shine off it. So we're basically going to try and aim to paint sort of up, sort of past that point, and we'll build it up, and then hopefully we won't get much paint at all around by the masking, and then once it's dry, we'll wet and dry again to try and sort of nicely feather the edges in, and hopefully, providing the aerosol is a decent colour match, the end result should be pretty good, hopefully. So we'll get the paint on. So just dust coats to start with, so quite a thin coat for the first couple of coats. And then we'll build it up basically as we get on. We can put slightly thicker coats on. So what I'm looking for when I put the paint on, I'm watching for, once it goes shiny, if you're looking across it in the light, once the paint has got a shine to it, it means there's enough paint on there. If you keep putting paint on, that's when you can get ronds forming. So we're looking basically to put enough paint on so it looks wet and kind of a continuous sheen, but not so much that it's dripping. But like I say, these first couple of coats is really just a very thin coat, and that's to prevent the solvent in the paint basically effectively affecting the paint underneath, which can then cause the colour to bleed through from the underneath layers. So it just means you end up needing to put loads and loads of paint on. So a couple of thin coats, and then we'll basically work. We've got several bits on the van, we're painting at the same time, basically just working around between them. Okay, so we'll stop there. You can start to see you're getting a bit of a shine on it. So we'll just stop, and then we'll leave that kind of 10 minutes, and we'll come back to it and just do another sort of similar coat. Paint's on, there's probably what, 4 or 5 coats again we've put on that, so we've tried to get it so that we've got a bit of a shine to the areas where we've been painting, and then obviously the extremes of the panel, it's a little bit rougher finish, you can hear that there, but that's where we'll get in there with the wet and dry again, and sort of tidy it all up. So, but the main game, it's been about 10 minutes since we put the last coat on, so it should be touch dry. We'll get the masking off now. And then we'll need to leave it probably overnight, I would suggest, just to get it properly hard before we start trying to do any wet and drying, and then hopefully it's going to look the part. We've left this overnight from when we took the masking off, and just to let the paint sort of harden up a bit, and I don't know if it shows in the camera, but what we've got now is these kind of, where I put the extent of the masking, we've got a wee bit of a line here between the original paint in the van and effectively overspray, so you can actually feel how rough this bit is. So what the plan today is we'll wet and dry this back just like we did with the primer. The main difference is I'm using my second-hand bit of wet and dry paper, so you can see here how it's starting to wear out. It just means it's much finer than the actual 1200 grit as advertised, and it's absolutely brilliant for when you're doing the top coat. So we can basically go at it fairly hard, round the edges here, just to get rid of this overspray, and then we'll actually do over the top of the whole repair, which should help bring the shine out in the paint, and then we can polish it up with a bit of cutting compound, and then that should get us up to a nice shine. So just like before, really, I'm just going to pick an edge, get my fingers going along the edge of the paint, and I'm just going to gradually rub away. The overspray is much thinner at the edges here, so actually it really doesn't take an awful lot to get rid of this. So I'm kind of listening, so you can hear when I'm on the paint it sounds rough. When I'm on the car, the smooth original paint, it doesn't sound so rough. So I'm basically just keeping going until I don't hear that change in note between going across my edge. So, and just like we're doing with the primer, you just got to be a wee bit careful just to keep a bit of an eye on what you're doing. So obviously what you do not want to do is cut through too much and end up with primer or something showing through from underneath, because basically then you'd have to paint again. So just need to be a little bit careful what you do. So got a bit of cutting compound. Cutting compound is quite an abrasive paste, so use it in body shops really to do the initial polish up. So it will get rid of the kind of fine scratches that the wet and dry paper's put in, and will start to bring up a bit of a shine. And what we'll do is rub this in, and then we'll polish it up, and then we'll go in with basically a finer cutting compound. So in our case we're just using T-cut, which is a very fine cutting paste. So you can hear here it still sounds pretty rough, to be honest, so we might need to do a little bit more wet and dry on this, but we'll have a look at it once we've given it a bit of white with this. Now it's a little bit of personal preference here. What I'm tending to do with this cutting compound is I'm trying to work mainly front to back, because if you work up and down like this, as you look along the van, you always see these kind of vertical slight scratching in the light, whereas if you work along the panel, it's a little bit like sanding in the direction of a grain of wood. It just looks better basically when you're standing back and looking at it. I'm using slightly circular motions, but I'm trying to go mainly along the way and not up and down. So, and then we'll basically go in with a finer cutting compound. So I'm using T-cut here, which is a kind of DIY version, but there's professional equivalents. This is basically just like the cutting compound, but it is finer. It's less abrasive. And the idea behind this is we'll actually bring up a bit of a mirror light shine, and that's hopefully the idea. What I should say, I masked this up again just like I did when I was cutting the primer, and it just prevents the kind of slurry from the wet and dry going on the plastics, and also the residue of the polish. So if you didn't do that, you'd end up with this type of problem along the plastic of the bumper, and actually it's surprisingly difficult to get off. So just 2 minutes of masking saves you a lot of cleaning up at the end. there's a fair amount of cleaning to do on this band, so we've still got residue here, which is the adhesive from the vinyl wrap, so I have to get all that off still. But there you go, start to see it. You start to get a bit of a shine, and what I'm hoping is if I've done this reasonably and the paint spray can is a reasonable match, you wouldn't actually see the edges of where the original paint, you know, goes into the new paint.
So I actually think this repair has turned out really quite well. There is an extremely slight textural difference which you can see if you get it in the correct light and you look at it very closely. You can just see some sort of textural change where the filler is. But if you're not looking for it from even a couple of feet away, it's basically invisible. So I'm extremely impressed with that just from basically a spray can. I think we did a fairly good job. But yes, that's going to bring this episode to a close. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, found it interesting. Make sure to subscribe and turn your notifications on so you'll be notified next week when episode 3 comes out. And I'll see you all then. Bye.